History taught you that the Black Death was one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. It wasn't. The plague that swept into Sicily in 1347 killed between 30 and 60% of everyone in Europe. Entire cities emptied. Parents buried children. Villages were abandoned to the grass. We call it a catastrophe. But what came after? The Renaissance, the rise of the middle class, the scientific revolution, the modern world, was built on those 25 million graves. This is Kaffa, 1346. The moment the plague crossed from east to west. The moment the rats boarded the ships. What if they didn't? This is what 2026 looks like when the Great Leveler never arrives. To understand what the plague's absence means, you first have to understand what Europe looked like just before it arrived. By 1340, Europe was already in crisis. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 had killed up to 15% of Northern Europe's population. Failed harvests, flooded fields, grain prices that peasant families could not survive. The continent had already breached its agricultural ceiling. Population had tripled between 1000 and 1340, from 35 million to over 75 million, driven by a warm period that opened new farmland. By 1340, every scrap of viable land was under cultivation, and much that wasn't viable was being farmed anyway. The people were starving before the plague arrived. The plague finished what the famine started. In our timeline, the die-off was catastrophic in the short run and transformative in the long run. Labor became scarce. A surviving peasant could demand wages or walk to the next village where a lord was desperate. The ironclad logic of feudalism, you work this land because there is nowhere else to go, cracked. In this timeline, the ships from Kaffa don't carry the plague west. Europe never gets that crack. The point of divergence, October 1346. The Mongol Khan Janibeg, besieging the Genoese trading post at Kaffa on the Crimean coast, orders a conventional assault rather than resorting to biological warfare. His army is sick and losing cohesion. The historical catapulting of plague corpses over the walls was an act of desperation. If the walls fall conventionally, the Genoese flee by land, not by sea. The infected rats never board the ships. The Black Death stays east of the Bosphorus. With no plague, the population crisis of 1340 doesn't resolve. It compounds. By 1360, Europe has 80 million people and agricultural output that cannot feed them. The famine pressure that the plague would have released just keeps building. For the peasantry, nothing changes. That is the point. In our world, plague survivors found themselves in a transformed labor market. The lords needed them. They had leverage for the first time in centuries. The slow erosion of serfdom followed, rising wages, a peasantry with enough surplus to eventually become something more. None of that happens without the die-off. The land subdivides with every generation. A family holding 12 acres in 1300 becomes 4 acres split 3 ways by 1360. Each generation poorer than the last. No labor shortage to offer escape. The landlord class feels none of this. Labor is abundant. Rents hold because the alternative to paying is starvation. The feudal hierarchy, which in our world was cracking by 1380, remained structurally intact. The system works perfectly if you are at the top of it. The counterintuitive truth of this timeline, the survival of 25 million people, was a catastrophe for everyone who survived. In our timeline, the Black Death broke the church. Not because people lost faith, many became more devout. But the institutional church was shattered by scale, clergy died at the same rates as laypeople, entire dioceses lost their priests, and rushed replacements gave reformers easy targets. More importantly, plague survivors had watched the Church's explanations fail in real time. The questioning that produced Wycliffe, Hus, and eventually Luther was watered by the plague's carnage. In this timeline, the Church doesn't face that crisis. It remains the largest landowner in Europe, the educational monopoly, the court of final appeal. It suppresses heterodox thinkers efficiently, because it has no credibility wound forcing it to concede ground. The universities remain under Church supervision. The curriculum stays scholastic. Natural philosophy, what we would call science, exists, but it sits in the same institutional corset it wore in 1200. The questions that drive inquiry are still theological questions. The methods are still Aristotelian syllogism. It is not going anywhere fast. The Renaissance was not an accident. It was financed. The conditions that produced it were a product of the post-plague world, Italian city-states wealthy from trade networks rebuilt after the die-off, a merchant class with money and no feudal obligations, and a church shaken enough that secular patronage of secular ideas became culturally possible. Without the plague, those conditions don't materialize. Wealth accumulates in the Italian city-states. Trade continues. But without the post-plague labor market revolution that put disposable income into new hands, the merchant class is smaller, more conservative, and tightly bound to noble and ecclesiastical patrons. The Medici exist, but as rich wool merchants in a medieval economy, not the dominant banking house of a transforming continent. Without Renaissance Florence there is no perspective painting, no systematic anatomy, no architectural revolution that Newton eventually builds on. There may still be movable type, but without a literate middle class to read the books, printing transforms nothing. The men who would have been Leonardo and Michelangelo are born into this world. They are gifted craftsmen working for the Church in an idiom the Church approves. They never become what they were. The knowledge sits locked in monastery libraries. It has nowhere to go. So what does the world look like in 2026? Europe is not one thing. It is many things, none of them recognizable. The feudal system did not survive intact. No social system is static across 7 centuries. But its dissolution was not the revolutionary rupture of our 15th through 18th centuries. It was a slow grinding erosion, fought against entrenched nobility and church authority centimeter by centimeter. No Locke. No Rousseau. No declaration of the rights of man. Labor rights developed slowly because the ideas that demand them never formed coherently. The Industrial Revolution happened around 1850 in this timeline, not 1750, driven by state military projects rather than a confident merchant class with capital. Top-down, militarized. The factory owners are often the same landed noble families who once owned the serfs now operating the machines. Elsewhere the picture is sharply different. The Ottoman Empire, never facing a technologically superior West, is a constitutional sultanate of 600 million people in 2026, the world's most powerful single polity. China, free of European imperial pressure, is a republic of 2 billion and the world's largest economy. The Americas carry the most striking divergence. European colonization arrived a century later, the 1590s, not the 1490s, with less military capacity behind it. Several indigenous polities had more time to adapt. 3 large indigenous confederacies sit in the interior of North America in 2026, recognized as sovereign states. There was no American Revolution. No United States. British North America achieved independence around 1880 by negotiation, not war. The resulting republic is smaller, younger, and not a superpower. Here is the hardest question about this world. It is worse, by most material measures, than ours. Higher poverty. Lower life expectancy in Europe. The democratic traditions that emerged from the Renaissance, Reformation, and Enlightenment arrived late or not at all. But there was no Holocaust. No Hiroshima. The specific catastrophes that industrial modernity made possible at scale never occurred, because industrial modernity arrived differently, without the concentrated national-state military machinery that made them possible. A different world. Not simply better or worse. Built on the absence of 25 million people who, in dying, accidentally gave their survivors something they could never have given them alive. We have a name for the Black Death. We call it a catastrophe. We teach it as a wound. But wounds can be the mechanism of survival. The scar tissue that forms over a broken bone is stronger than the original. The disruption that killed 25 million people in 4 years broke open a system that had trapped 75 million more in perpetual, compounding poverty with no visible exit. The absence of catastrophe is not safety. Sometimes it is just a different kind of catastrophe, one that arrives so gradually no single generation sees it as a disaster at all. A catastrophe of stagnation. Of ceilings that never crack. Of potential that compounds in silence across centuries and never finds its release. The Black Death was the worst thing that ever happened to medieval Europe. It was also, somehow, the best thing that ever happened to the people who came after. Would you trade this world, with all its industrial horrors and democratic rights, for a world that never had the plague? The comment section is below. I genuinely don't know the answer. Until the vault opens again, subscribe to the Alternate Archive.